I'd like to welcome everyone to the second Janus session, which in this case is to do with motor development. If we could have the doors at the back closed, that would be really good. Thank you. So my name is Jill Whittle. I am the presider of this session. My main responsibility is actually to introduce the moderator. But before I do that, I have to tell you a little bit about myself, I guess. So I've been at NASPA for 34 years. I've been on the program for motor development, either as chair or as a member, I think 5 times. I was a senior lecturer. I have the honor of having the President's Award. I've also been the Secretary Treasurer and the President, and I start a past President's Liaison tomorrow. So, thank you, whoever that was. So it's really my pleasure now to introduce Mike Wade, who actually I found out just now was at the very first 1967 conference. He is a professor and past chair of kinesiology and a faculty member at the University of Minnesota Center for Cognitive Science. He's really well known for his work in studying developmental changes across the lifespan, and in particular for his emphasis on individuals with movement difficulties. As I mentioned, he's been around a long time, and he's also been on the program chair for motor development many times, both as chair and a member. He's been senior scholar and distinguished scholar and a President's Award awardee. And he's also been the president of this of the society too. So, because he is such a distinguished person, we didn't just ask him to moderate, but we also asked him to tell a few, as he said, war stories, just for a short period of time before we start with our 2 main speakers. So here's Mike.
Good morning. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time. As usual, I've got many more slides than I need, but I did want to make a few remarks. I was 1 year later than Glyn Roberts in claiming to be the oldest person to have been associated with NASPA, but Glyn is older than me, so he deserves that. But let me go through my slides and make a few comments on them. It's partly historical and partly, I think, to do with sort of where we are with motor development. Jane gave a nice talk on Sunday evening going through the history, the Clark and Whittle paper. But I did think that she, on this process-oriented one, it really was, it didn't basically lay out where we went from information processing to these dynamical systems approaches and the view of perception from an ecological point of view being direct rather than indirect. So I just wanted to take us through a couple of these slides. So the psychologists early on were involved in the neuromaturational approach, and much of that descriptive work from our perspective was carried out by the Wisconsin group, Lola Halverson and Marianne Roberton, Jack Keogh, the late Jack Keogh, and Jack Craddy at UCLA, and Vern Seefeld at Michigan State. All of these individuals in our field kind of carried on that descriptive approach to looking at changes in development. And this typically was the kind of thing that you saw on locomotion, where we would have these kind of milestones, as they were called, and eventually the child was able to maintain upright posture, started to cruise, started to locomote, and as Karen Adolph said, started to explore. And it's the exploration that rapidly produced cognitive development. But the question was this a question of brain readiness in terms of when this child could figure out how to walk somewhere between 9 for the precocious kids and 14 months? So was it neuromaturation or was it physics? If it was neuromaturation, the notion was that it was basically brain-controlled or brain maturation. Certainly maturation is an issue, but was the brain sort of saying to the body, you can walk now? It wasn't. It was physics. Every mother knows that when the delivery professional says, one more push, I can see its crown, I can see its head. If the head comes out, everything else follows. As you can see, at this age, and for quite a little bit of time, walking is biomechanically impossible. I tell my students, if you want to figure out what it's like for a kid who has not yet got a head size that's in reasonable scale to the rest of the body, when you go to the supermarket, put a 30-pound sack of potatoes on your head and see how that works. It's just straight physics. The brain's not telling the body how to walk. But that, of course, has produced a lot of activity that relies on neuromotor control. I notice in the talks that I've been attending this time round, we're talking a lot about perceived motor competence. So that begs the question, what's being perceived? And is the information in the environment meaningful or meaningless? Arthur Koestler said if Descartes had kept a poodle, the history of philosophy would have been different. The poodle would have taught Descartes that contrary to his doctrine, animals are not machines, and hence the human body is not a machine. So that says that the indirect perception, the notion that the world doesn't make sense to us, requires some inner room, some copy, in order to make the information that we observe, usually with our eyes, meaningful. And that has led to, 40, 50 years of information processing in terms of trying to understand motor control and coordination. So the early on people who were involved in this was Kevin Connolly, who was a psychologist at Sheffield, Jack Adams, you remember his closed loop theory, and dear old Dick, of course, with the schema theory. All of these kind of approaches were very prevalent when we had our first NASPA meeting outside of the auspices of what was then called AFA, and we held it at Allerton Park. And Connolly came, Jack was there, Dick Schmidt was there, Michael Turvey was there. Now, Michael Turvey came from Loughborough College. He took a master's degree in physical education at Ohio State, wrote to me about blueberry pie and that I ought to really come to the United States, which I did, and finished up with a PhD in experimental psychology, made a good reputation for himself in verbal learning, but now I think has been one of the pioneers in trying to understand how living systems control and coordinate movement, and is a big proponent of Gibson's view of direct perception. So a shout out for Michael. Also a shout out for Alfred Hubbard, who has never been recognized by NASPA other than a President's Award, but I invite all of you to read his amazing chapter called Homo Kinetics. The other individual in the meantime is Arthur Slater Hamill, and I believe we ought to spend a little bit more time recognizing Arthur Slater Hamill and Alfred Hubbard, along with Franklin Henry. But I digress. After that, we have this systems approach, the dynamical systems approach, most of which was looked at from the perspective of Bernstein, who in 1937 was arguing the so-called degrees of freedom problem. In other words, how do the many degrees of freedom in our body, 10 squared bones, 10 cubed muscles, 10 to the 9th neurons, how do you suppress all those degrees of freedom in order to carry out some intentful activity? And then, of course, that coupled, all dynamical systems don't embrace Gibson's view of ecological perception, but those two taken together have promoted a different view of how that works. And that was followed up a great deal by Esther Thalen, who I believe started out as a biologist, but her work really opened up this notion that it's the activity of the child that controls the outcome and allows the child to understand what's going on in its world very early on. And Beverly and Esther Thalen published this nice little SRCD book called Hidden Skills. And you had the notion that the notion of development takes very, very different pathways. It's certainly not linear. It has all different shapes and sizes as the child develops. So that question was, why are these skills hidden? Well, the reason why these skills are hidden is that we didn't provide the child with sufficient postural support. Remember, pre-locomotion. And what Esther did on this so-called amazing disappearing step reflex, which all of the motor information processing folks had no real idea. They just said, oh, well, it's reflexes changing to something else. Esther had the bright idea of holding babies over the treadmill and eliciting the step reflex. Then she put the baby in water a little bit later so that there was some postural support, and guess what happens? The step reflex is still there. It's constrained. In another way, Klaus von Hofsten and Esther also put babies in a sling, providing postural support, and guess what? The baby could anticipate intercepting a moving, what do they call them? What are these things that babies go round and round above their head? There you go. Which is the same as when you hunt. I mean, if you want to bring the goose down, don't fire at its tail, anticipate it, fire in front of its bill, and boom, down it'll go. The baby did this. So these are very, very exotic skills once the postural support is there. And to finish up, there, I'm going really fast. To finish up, Robert Rosen, who Scott Kelso invoked the other day, Robert Rosen's living systems biology pushed up the notion that if you have a natural system, and 2 or 3 times in presentations the last couple of days, the word encoding has been used. So if in fact you take a natural system, you implicate that some encoding goes on, you then finish up with this inferential system, which is the information processing approach. But Rosen says, well, wait a minute. When you go from here, you presumably have to go to decoding. And no one ever mentions the fact that if you encode the system to store information in the head, you presumably have to decode it in order to make it meaningful to a living system. So in a very, very short period of time, I hope I've set the stage for our 2 speakers today. David Anderson, who is a professor at San Francisco State University, and Leah Robinson, who I believe spent time at Auburn before going to the Harvard of the Midwest, the University of Michigan. And so we will hear 2 presentations from them, and I don't know how much time we're giving you. 30 minutes? I will figure that out. We will take some questions after each presentation so that there's not too much recall, and then if there's time at the end, we will have some more questions. I had one announcement that Penny wanted me to make, and that was that the business luncheon will follow immediately after this, and you have a ticket in your little name tag here, and she wants you to go there immediately. So without any further ado, let me introduce David, and off we go.